So does anybody actually enjoy Star Wars, or are we just all kind of conditioned to think that we do? Alright kids, now that we've come out the gate swinging, raise your hand if you have a complicated relationship with Star Wars. I have spent literally decades trying to really figure out if I actually love this franchise or if I just kind of tolerate it. There are certainly bits about Star Wars that I genuinely enjoy, but on the whole, most of the franchise feels so overly huge and sloggy and complicated and overpopulated, all while being picked apart by toxic fanboys who can't stand the fact that Luke Starkiller drank alien titty milk while in a depressive state. Sorry, I accidentally referred to Luke Skywalker as Luke Starkiller, which was his original name before George Lucas changed it. Star Wars was actually a couple of months into production before Lucas changed the name from Starkiller to Skywalker, allegedly due to the worry that the name might be unintentionally associated with Charles Manson, who was, quote, a real star killer after the murder of movie stars Sharon Tate. Of course, we would eventually get the character of Star Killer in the 2008 video game Soul Calibur 4, so the name would still get some mileage out of it. Sorry, you're probably already rushing to point out that Star Killer was the star of the 2008 video game The Force Unleashed, but before you hit publish on the comment button, I would just like to remind you that Soul Calibur 4 came out in July of 2008, whereas The Force Unleashed came out in September of that same year, so Star Killer's debut was actually in the Namco Bandai game. You kids ever think about coming for my nerd card and you're gonna have a hard time of it. Star Wars has all these tiny quibbles and details that are so easy to get lost in. So many different shows and books and video games, let alone the actual live action flicks that we've gotten since 1977. And in a lot of ways, with the huge variety of media born out of this franchise, there then exists wildly oscillating discourse between oftentimes toxic fans who all think they know more about their beloved Space Wizard series than anyone else does. I really think sometimes that everyone forgets that Star Wars is literally just pulp adventure set in space, and it really shouldn't be taken that seriously. And when you don't take it that seriously, it can be a whole lot of fucking fun. Now, I've spent the better part of 40 years trying to figure out why, or more precisely what, I like about Star Wars. I know a minute ago I said I don't know if I do or not, but stay with me for a second, kids, because once upon a time, there were only 3 movies. And then after that came a series of novels that expanded the universe and told us tales that existed beyond the bounds of the films into uncharted territory, past the wub-jub ending of Return of the Jedi. I don't care what the special editions did to the finale of Jedi. The wub-jub song is the only goddamn song those homicidal teddy bears were singing, and that's that on that. When I was a kid, Return of the Jedi was the flick that I primarily watched the most. The first movie was a little too cheesy and drawn out. Empire was too dark and serious. But for 10-year-old Ranger, Jedi was absolutely the shit. It had the best lightsaber fight. It had the battle in Jabba's palace. It had the space battle over Endor. Everything about it was alive and electric and a roller coaster from start to finish. In the late 80s, early 90s, we started getting officially licensed novels that, as mentioned a minute ago, expanded the Star Wars universe with brand new stories, such as the Thrawn trilogy written by Timothy Zahn, a trilogy that was considered by many fans to be the unofficial episodes 7, 8, and 9. Myself, I wasn't really that interested in reading Star Wars books. I was a big sci-fi nerd at a young age, and I read tons of Star Trek novels, but Star Wars, I don't know, I just couldn't be arsed to give a shit about anything outside of the actual movies. There always seemed to be too many characters, too many stories, too much of too much, and so much so that it all kind of stacked up on top of each other in a kind of overwhelming charcuterie buffet, offering plenty of everything for everyone, while feeling like there wasn't anything of substance beyond the actual fucking movies. But it was the tail end of 1996 where things started to change for me. December 3rd, 1996, a little game called Star Wars Shadows of the Empire released for the brand new Nintendo 64 console. What made this game intriguing was the fact that it was heavily hyped as taking place between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, while placing players in the role of a brand new mercenary character named Dash Rendar. Shadows of the Empire brilliantly opens up with a recreation of the Battle of Hoth from the opening of Empire Strikes Back, into a series of stages that each feature different gameplay mechanics, from swoop racing to asteroid demolition to running through an Imperial base. The combination of the cutting-edge graphics, cutting edge for 1996 graphics, the new character being roguish and charming, and the ample usage of John Williams' iconic score, Shadows of the Empire was my gateway drug to being able to experience the experience of Star Wars movies outside of watching the films themselves. Fast forward a little bit to October 10th, 1997, and the second game to fully immerse me in the Star Wars experience was released: Star Wars Dark Forces 2 Jedi Knight, or as it is colloquially, I hate that fucking word, or as it's colloquially known these days, Jedi Knight. Sure, the early 3D graphics engine was rough and rudimentary, and the level design was sometimes batshit obtuse, but for my money, there has never been a game that has fully captured the Star Wars experience the way Jedi Knight has. It takes the best of both Star Wars worlds and combines them into one. You start as a thuggish mercenary on a quest for revenge before gaining a lightsaber and knowledge of the Force, before finally evolving into a full-fledged Jedi Knight by the end of it. It does what it sets out to do and takes everything great about Star Wars and condenses it down into a perfect package of jank and Jedis. Of course, 1997 also saw the release of the Star Wars Special Editions in theaters, followed by the first of the prequel films in 1999, The Phantom Menace. This was peak Star Wars for me, even though it was a little too shiny for my taste, but my interest in Star Wars was never higher than that summer. I was still playing Shadows of the Empire and Jedi Knight. Phantom Menace was in theaters. It felt like it could only get better from there. Oh no. Listen, I could go on at length and take up this whole video talking about Star Wars and how I really feel about it, about how I can't seem to stand it, and yet I also know all of this odd trivia about it, how modern Star Wars just does absolutely nothing for me. Except these two. These are my favorite fucking movies in the whole franchise, so let that sink in. But instead, let's focus more on a Star Wars game that I skipped over entirely back when it released, because I, A, didn't have a great PC for running new games, and B, wasn't that fucking interested in Star Wars at the time. The game that preceded Jedi Knight, the original, the first, Dark Forces. Way back in the year 1993, the eventual project leader of Dark Forces, Darren Stinnett, came to the hallowed halls of Lucasarts with a love of Star Wars and a keen interest in a recently released computer game, Wolfenstein 3D. For some reason, there's a common misconception that Dark Forces, the first-person shooter released by Lucasarts on February 28, 1995, was a response to the fan-made Doom mod, which was set on the Death Star and had the player battling numerous foes from a galaxy far, far away. It even says this on the game's Wikipedia page. But the truth is that Dark Forces was a glint in the eye of the developers well before the release of Doom. Stinnett's fascination with Wolfenstein was the first thing he brought up while entering LucasArts. Being asked what kind of game he would like to make, he said, something like Wolfenstein. LucasArts could see the writing on the wall and were immediately interested. Funny enough, Indiana Jones was one of the first concepts tossed about for this FPS project, but LucasArts being LucasArts, the dev team was staffed full of people who adored Star Wars, and approval was swiftly granted to start work, with developer Ray Gresco brought on to lead programming work and developer Justin Chin to tackle art and storyline. From the outset, the team knew that they wanted to completely immerse the player in the Star Wars universe, from locations to sound effects and the general thrill of watching the films, and so imagined Luke Skywalker as the main character for the game. Unfortunately, there were a few too many restrictions on using Luke for the game, from canon story placement to having Luke Skywalker literally gunning down dozens of stormtroopers at a time, so the team devised a brand new character for the game to allow them more freedom in storytelling: mercenary Kyle Katarn. Oh, just look at him. Kyle Katarn is everything that I love about Star Wars in one single character. I fell in love with the lad when I played Jedi Knight, following his rise from Merc to Jedi, but here he's just a straightforward gun-for-hire running with the Rebellion after spending some time working for the Empire. Originally an officer in the Imperial Navy, Kyle discovered that the details of his father's death had been covered up by the Empire in order to keep certain things from coming to light, details that we can cover when we get to Jedi Knight. So Kyle abandoned post, got himself a ship to hop around the galaxy with, and signed up with the Rebels on a for-hire basis. Having this brand new future icon to work with set the devs at LucasArts free to get wild with plot and story, leading to Justin Chin and Paul Micah conjuring the idea of the Dark Troopers. Modern fans of Star Wars will know this intimidating cybernetic version of stormtroopers from The Mandalorian, but they first appeared all the way back in 1995, kids. Dark Troopers were a way for the devs to keep player interest in the ongoing threats of the game, rather than present a singular destructive force like the Death Star as a kind of endgame. Justin Chin stated, quote, "Instead of just beefing up the stormtroopers, I designed them to be more efficient. I wanted something more terrifying and more omnipotent." Which at first he really leaned hard into, producing a Star Wars soldier that drew heavy inspiration from manga and anime. Now, depending on who's telling the story, it was either Lucasfilm Licensing who stepped in and requested changes to the design in order to fall more in line with the established aesthetics of the films, or it was George Lucas himself. Regardless of the actual source, Chin ended up submitting 3 total pieces of concept art before finally getting approval from upstairs. With this concept in mind, Dark Troopers were implemented into the game as a sort of boogeyman that could appear around any corner and present a fraught challenge in the midst of an already chaotic situation. And this, you see, is what helps Dark Forces stand out from the crowd of FPS titles hurriedly being released around the time of 1995, an ongoing plot and story for players to interact with. Now, we've already seen the seeds of story-driven FPS sown with Marathon in 1994, but what's different here with Dark Forces is that LucasArts already had a pedigree for narrative-based gameplay. Obviously, this is a channel focused more on first-person shooters and action pew-pew games, but boy oh boy was I obsessed with point-and-click adventure games back in the day. Sierra had some good titles, but for my money, LucasArts was where it was at. By the time Dark Forces began development, LucasArts had already released the first 2 Monkey Island games, 2 Indiana Jones games, Maniac Mansion and its sequel Day of the Tentacle, and perennial favorite Sam & Max Hit the Road. And those are just the big titles from that period. So the development of Dark Forces focused on the strengths that LucasArts was bringing to the table based on previous games, and that was telling a rich story, which involved animated cutscenes, mission briefing screens with specific objectives, fully voiced in-game dialogue.
Okay, Jan, I've rescued Maine. Don't hang around, let's get out of here before any more troopers arrive.
As well as a focus on player exploration and puzzle solving within gameplay. In order to facilitate this, Ray Gresco led the development of the game's own 3D engine, the Jedi engine. LucasArts went in knowing they wanted to aim for something more technically advanced than the recently released Doom, so they went for the graphical jugular. The ability to have rooms over rooms, the ability to look up and down, fully 3D objects and moving environments, atmospheric effects like fog, as well as animated textures and shading. Folding the technology into the gameplay and immersion, Darren Stinnett said they wanted to be able to create active environments where, as he said, ships come and go with the flight decks, rivers sweep along, platforms and conveyor belts move, and much of the machinery functions. They even hired architects to help with the level creation in order to make the environments feel more believable. Combining the extensive depth of world building and narration with this technological weightlifting, LucasArts created something that, for my money, is the step forward in innovation that Looking Glass was attempting with System Shock. Where Looking Glass's technology was unfortunately cumbersome and did not service the narrative elements very well, LucasArts has taken the 2 elements to a negotiation table and gotten a firm handshake out of the pairing. Dark Forces automap is pretty damn potent, operating on the same basics as other automaps of the time, in which it builds the map based on line of sight. One downside to it is that it doesn't indicate doors or switches, but it does indicate moving platforms, so it's still highly effective for navigation. Meanwhile, running through the story-based missions, sometimes our hero will be asked to collect and utilize special codes to enter at security stations. Of course, while the game does utilize special colored keys for accessing doors of the same hue, when it comes to puzzle elements like the aforementioned codes, the game doesn't go so easy on you. A quick press of F1 to switch to the inventory screen will give you a full view of anything and everything Kyle is carrying, including said codes, so you can visually identify which buttons you need to manipulate. To that extent, the animated textures that the engine can produce are essential to understanding how you've manipulated the world with a button press. Whether that's in opening up different waterways to access the sewer, or seeing which level an elevator is currently at, or deducing a puzzle involving doors within concentric rings, as you change access to the areas around you, the game will let you know just from the button press what you've done, allowing you to figure out on the fly where to move next. Compared to the sometimes frustrating switch hunting tendencies of other FPS titles at the time, Dark Forces does its level best to integrate the storytelling into the environment, which makes it feel even more like a natural evolution of the point-and-click gameplay LucasArts had been fostering for years. Development was full of excitement and sometimes surprises, with a couple fun little stories to come out of it. For example, at one point, Darren Stinnett was giving a demonstration of the game in progress for a news outlet, and George himself was there for the presentation. He got to sit down and run through the the gameplay they had for the event, and while he seemed to enjoy himself, afterwards he leaned over to Stinnett and remarked, "Well, this is a little violent." Apparently, George Lucas didn't exactly vibe with the notion of being able to shoot and kill Imperial officers with blaster fire, as opposed to the fully wholesome ideal of mowing down hundreds of stormtroopers. The reasoning, however, is that stormtroopers are purposefully faceless enemies, making the violence against them slightly more family-friendly, since they don't look like actual humans with human faces, just nameless, faceless, fascist soldiers to serve as his bloodless blaster cannon fodder. George must have eventually come around, because he showed up with Stinnett at the opening of the Indiana Jones ride at Disneyland to promote and hype the game. Maybe even George Lucas can change his mind on what constitutes good Star Wars and bad Star Wars.
The bees hereabouts? Crazy!
Okay, maybe not. But perhaps he was brought around by the absolutely authentic Star Wars experience that Lucasarts was able to imbue into the game. Utilizing the full library of sound effects and visuals from Lucasfilm's archives, the Lucasarts team was able to achieve unprecedented immersion with such details as proper blaster fire sound effects, vocals for Imperial officers and stormtroopers, machinery sounds, as well as being able to rip specific visuals of characters directly from the films in order to have them appear in-game. Characters such as Darth Vader, Mon Mothma, Jabba the Hutt, and Boba Fett as well. Rounding out the technological immersion was a brilliantly realized MIDI soundtrack by legendary LucasArts composer Clint Bajakian, who drew on numerous cues from the original work of John Williams while composing a number of original tracks as well. Bajakian is a personal favorite of mine, having been introduced to his style through his soundtracks for 3 different Indiana Jones games: Fate of Atlantis, Infernal Machine, and Emperor's Tomb. Bajakian can conjure Williams' themes to such an uncanny degree that I swear to God there should only ever be 2 composers who ever write music for Star Wars: John Williams and Clint Bajakian. Bajakian also utilized an interactive music system that LucasArts used for pretty much all of their point-and-click games at the time, the iMuse, or Interactive Music Streaming Engine. Going back to comparisons with System Shock, which also utilized a dynamic score, iMuse synchronizes the composed music with the visual actions happening in-game, transitioning between musical themes on the fly. Quiet moments can suddenly become intense at the drop of a hat as stormtroopers come barreling down the corridors, enhancing the cinematic flair of the goings-on. The combined focus on making the technology competitive, the gameplay immersive, and the experience authentic to the source material absolutely contributed to the game being incredibly well received by critics and fans alike. Sure, there were a few complaints from the reviewer side of things, while detractors cited a lack of multiplayer as a drawback, and also pointed towards the game's somewhat short length as compared to other titles in the genre. Overall, the positive feedback was glowing, to the point where the devs received a letter from John Romero himself, in which he let them know that he had just finished playing through the game and said, quote, "Now I know how everyone else felt when they played Doom." If that's not high fucking praise, then I don't know what is. Dark Forces has enjoyed a healthy legacy in terms of the Star Wars games, but in a lot of ways I kind of feel like it's been a little bit left behind. After all, Dark Forces' sequel, Jedi Knight, saw Kyle move in a completely different direction with his journey to becoming a Jedi Knight, and then the next game in the series, Jedi Knight 2, Jedi Outcast, cemented Kyle's Force status and also solidified the notion that lightsaber combat was not only viable in both single and multiplayer, but is an absolute must when done correctly. There would eventually be a 3rd game in the series titled Jedi Academy, and for that game, Kyle would be relegated to the position of mentor to a brand new player character that was shaped by the gamer. But considering the direction of the franchise, Dark Forces now stands alone as a sort of odd firstborn child, a more pure Star Wars experience in terms of the gritty, dirty, mechanical, everyday life sort of way, versus the games that followed in its wake. Sure, Sure, Jedi Knight innovated by introducing lightsaber combat and force powers to a 3D shooter for the first time, and both Jedi Outcast and Jedi Academy refined that combat in such a way as to be unmatched by any game until Jedi Fallen Order some 15 years later. But Dark Forces came first, and considering the era in which it was produced, it's still somehow seen by some as merely a Star Wars Doom clone. Well, kids, I'm here to tell you that I have finally played Dark Forces for the very first time, and I am happy to report that it is simply not the case at all. Getting to Dark Forces has always been a bit of an intimidating prospect for me, since, like many of the games of the DOS era, playing it on modern systems can feel like a bit of an enterprise in and of itself. Fortunately, just a few weeks before I sat down to go through this game, a fan-made source port called The Force Engine launched version 1.0 with full widescreen support, mouse support, all the bells and whistles that basically make the Force Engine GZ Doom for Star Wars. They're also hoping to have support for the other game running on the Jedi Engine, Outlaws, so that'll be useful when I eventually get to that game. A couple of notes on my playstyle before we really dive into things. Number 1, while the Force Engine allows players to save mid-game while playing through the missions, Dark Forces originally did not have this feature. Going off of that initial Wolfenstein inspiration, Dark Forces utilize a live system, where players would start off with 3 lives to get through a mission, although they can pick up more throughout the levels if they're dedicated enough. But this meant that they had to complete the mission in one run, and if they lost all their lives, it was back to the beginning. Fortunately, losing a life did not mean a straight-up restart of the whole level, as LucasArts graciously instituted a lovely safety net, in which the game would plop the player practically right back into the action via a series of invisible checkpoints refilling health while doing so. I decided to play through the game without relying on the lives I had in my pocket because, well, I wanted to be able to save wherever I wanted to, and also, being reloaded back into the game with full health just kind of felt like a touch of a cheat. I did utilize this from time to time because Dark Forces can be really fucking hard, and I found myself in some sticky situations low on health and up against tough odds. Every now and again I took the L and lost a life so I could just pop back in and not feel frustrated trying to run the same encounter over and over just because I was being prideful. Alright kids, with all of this history and notations put into place, let's take a look at a little game that became a giant and dive deep into the thrill ride that is Dark Forces. The game, in traditional Star Wars fashion, starts off like a rocket and pretty much refuses to slow down from there. The first mission is actually a prologue to the course of events the game will eventually lay out, dropping Kyle into an Imperial base with the job of stealing the blueprints for a brand new mega weapon that the Empire is currently building, perfectly establishing the base gameplay we'll be experiencing from here on out. Switches that manipulate the environment? Check. Keycards that activate specifically colored doors? Check. Moving platforms and elevators and room-over-room map layouts? Check. And most importantly of all, fast-paced stormtrooper blast in action. This is the #1 thing that the game had to get right, not just as a first-person shooter, but as a Star Wars game. If the blaster action hadn't felt right from point one, this game wouldn't have worked in the slightest, but it does. Boy, oh boy, does it. Movement is quick and responsive. I had to fiddle with mouse sensitivity a little bit, but that's par for the course. The sound of the blaster fire is ripped straight from the films and has a little extra oomph behind it, like you're actually holding the rifle in your hands. The details in the animations when enemies are hit and go down, the extra frames to make them look fluid and cinematic. The animation in this game is fucking gorgeous. Oh, and the feedback from blaster fire is so good. From each shot fired to the impact of each bolt, it's so visceral that I swore my mouse had a rumble pack in it. I've played a lot of FPS games in my 40 years, and I've been playing FPS games almost non-stop for the past 2 years working on this channel. And there are few games I can think of that just immediately, off the jump, feel like a blast of adrenaline straight to the vein with combat, controls, and immersion this satisfying. You know, sometimes a game just needs a moment for mechanics to click into place, and then you have that aha moment where you understand how it all works. Dark Forces gets in your face and puts a blaster in your hand, and it just fucking works. It's good. It's so good. Between the urgency of the music utilizing various Star Wars cues, the authentic look and feel of the environment, the brief sight of the holographic Death Star reminding us exactly what we're doing here, the shouts of Imperial guards and stormtroopers, this has to be the single most effective opening level of an FPS that I have ever played. I'm probably forgetting a few good ones off the top of my head, so I'm going to say that this is at least top 5. At least. Once we blast our way to the end of the level, our ship, the Moldy Crow, comes flying down to pick us up, and we're off to the main plot of the game. Sometime after the first mission, we find ourselves in a cutscene featuring the Executor, Darth Vader's personal Super Star Destroyer, where the Dark Lord himself has a conversation with the primary antagonist of Dark Forces, an officer named General Mohc. Mohc deploys his brand new weapon, the Dark Troopers, as a demonstration to garner approval from Vader, which he gets based on the efficiency of the attack. Vader and Mohc are animated beautifully, utilizing the same animation techniques Lucasarts employed in their point-and-click games. We're going to get a bunch of these scattered throughout the course of the game, all of which are wonderful examples of early 90s computer animation and sound effects combined with effective storytelling. Say what you will about LucasArts, but even when their plots were somewhat harebrained or annoying, their cutscenes were consistently engaging and captivating to look at. We cut to Kyle Katarn receiving information from Mon Mothma, who's giving him the rundown on the recent attack. As we can see here in the cutscene, Kyle is no fucking joke. He's a big, beefy boy with shoulders for days and could probably arm wrestle a Wampa for fun and win. We'll see a little bit more of his brute strength later on in the game that, pretty much solidifies that last statement. Of course, like any charming Star Wars rogue, Kyle has got a bit of a sarcastic streak to him.
A new stormtrooper that can take out a rebel base that quickly? I should have kept working for the Empire.
Kyle, despite clearly seeing the forest for the trees, agrees to head to the attack site to grab evidence of this new kind of stormtrooper, and requests Rebel pilot Jan Ors to be his mission officer. Jan Ors and Kyle Katarn go together like peanut butter and jelly. Jan is an expert pilot who will be handling the Moldy Crow for us from now on, trade witty banter with us sometimes mid-mission, and will be delivering our mission briefings ahead of time. The briefings are great resources going into each mission. They clearly and concisely lay out the objectives for each level, offer visual aids for items, switches, and landmarks for us to look for, all while providing a bit of charm by having the briefing laid out in character by Jan. These are so fucking key to success. One of the things about previous narrative FPS titles like Marathon and Heretic was the lack of context for a lot of the switch hunting that happened in those games. Here with Dark Forces, there's so much context delivered and clues given that the only thing that players really have to focus on is navigating the missions themselves, which is fucking amazing. Mission-based objectives and objects to find, all delivered quickly and gently, and missions that are complex yet fair to navigate without an objective marker? Dark Forces might be 28 years old as of this video, but there are a lot of lessons to be learned from this game that modern titles could take notice of. As Kyle navigates the attack site in the footage for a moment, I want to take a brief look at the Hutt here. This is something that I'm already pretty well familiar with since I've played Jedi Knight so many times I could recite the game from memory, but we have an exquisite, clean, Spartan HUD style that keeps all the important information easy to read without taking up too much space. Down here, we've got the health and shield meter. Each meter has numeric values, but if you don't have the time to stop and look specifically at the number, you can tell at a glance how your shields are doing by how bright they are. With 2 layers of shields protecting your health, it's real easy to note whether or not you're doing good without taking your attention away from the action. You'll also note the single-digit number to the side, which is your lives counter. Over here is the weapon meter. The red number is your primary ammo count, the green number immediately above is for secondary ammo, although I think there's really only one weapon that has actual secondary ammo versus just a secondary fire. And the 5 green lights above that represents how many batteries you have for using gadgets, such as a headlamp or night vision goggles. Batteries are pretty plentiful in the first few stages, so you won't really have to worry about being able to see in the dark, but it is a good practice to make sure you turn your headlamp off when you're in well-lit areas, so you're already in the habit for future levels when batteries are a little more hard to find. Once we grab a Dark Trooper weapon that's been left behind, we'll need to circle around and head back to where we were dropped off in order for Jan to swoop down in the Moldy Crow for pickup. With this mission, we'll now have seen the 2 different mission completion pickups. Either Jan will meet us somewhere at the end of the level, or we'll be required to return to the drop-off point for evac. What's neat about completing missions is that the level doesn't just automatically end once we've hit all of our goals. We'll need to physically hit the escape button in order to confirm that we want to end the mission, which is pretty sweet because if we so desire, we can do a little secret hunting throughout the level once we've cleared the stage and have minimal resistance doing so before we move on to the next. Next mission involves tracking down an Imperial weapons specialist who's so paranoid that he's hidden himself down in a complicated maze-like sewer system with branching pathways that can only be unlocked one at a time. So we'll have to go down each one and flip a series of switches along each path, paying attention to the sewer water levels so we can access the area we need to get to. This mission introduces Imperial droids for us to tango with, as well as the sewer monsters that dragged Luke underwater in A New Hope, the Dianaga. I feel so very very fucking nerdy that I knew what they were called without having to look that shit up. Like, why do I have this information stuck in my brain? Anyways, this mission is real fun. Very tricksy. There's a couple of pathways where we'll be forced along specific routes due to rushing water pushing us along, but Kyle is such a beefcake that if you turn around and hold shift while jumping, you can bunny hop back against the current to head back and make sure you didn't miss anything. We do get introduced to a new weapon here, the thermal detonators, another perennial Star Wars weapon first introduced in Return of the Jedi, and I really don't like it. There's no real way to gauge how far you're going to be able to throw it. Trying to measure how long to hold down the mouse button feels like watching a pot of water getting ready to boil, and the second you look away, it's spilling over the sides. But if you try to pick it up when you think that you should, it's still cold. Primary mouse has the detonator explode on impact, which can be really finicky, especially if you throw the damn thing too hard and you hit the ceiling right above you and then you take damage from it. Secondary mouse has the detonator work on a timer, which is much easier to control, especially if you're having a difficult time gauging the range on your throws. I didn't use these much unless I had to clear out mines, which... we'll get to those soon enough. But once we find weapon specialist Moff Rebus, the mission is over and we can just hit escape without having to backtrack to find Jan. I love how this fucking doofus is just sitting here in his chair with a giant-ass energy rifle and a dumb grin on his face, but he doesn't attack or defend himself, he just surrenders. It's almost like he knows that Kyle is a goddamn space badass and so that he wouldn't stand a chance against him anyway. Our next mission has us infiltrating a weapons facility in order to steal a sample of the metal the Empire is using in the construction of the Dark Troopers. And this map is fucking huge. We start off carefully walking around and jumping across a variety of cliffside walkways before we can get to the base, which is full of air vents and ceiling turrets. The fucking ceiling turrets are just fucking awful. They fire more potent blaster energy than the standard Imperial goon, and if you stand still for too long, they'll take you out in seconds. The key to getting past them is moving side to side and circle strafing underneath them so they're forced to keep tracking your movements, all while you're unloading your blaster into them. So far, Dark Forces has been going a little easy on us, but this map sees the gloves kind of start to come off. There are officers and stormtroopers everywhere. The ceiling turrets will invalidate you, and those little training droids that Luke got zapped by once upon a time will be flitting about here and there, slowly whittling away your shields and health because you can't fucking hit them because they're moving around too goddamn fast. Of course, to our advantage, there's a brand new weapon here to pick up, and that is the repeater rifle. Sorry, the auto gun. It's called the repeater rifle in Jedi Knight. I'm just getting ahead of myself. A rapid fire projectile weapon that is slightly stronger than the blaster rifle, is good for stun locking, and has an alt fire, which is a 3-shot spread that, when performed up close, is basically the equivalent of a Star Wars shotgun. The only downside is that there isn't a lot of ammo for it here or in the next couple of stages, so use it wisely and effectively. We've also got a fun little platform puzzle involving manipulating a series of walkways in order to find the special metal that we've been looking for. And once we're done with that, it's hightailing back to the pickup for Jan to get us the hell out of here. Jan informs us that the metal we found is something called frick. The joke has already been done before, Ranger. Just move on. Just move on. So our next mission is to plop down to the Frick mining facility that the Empire is running so we can set some charges on the main reactor, blow the place to Kingdom Come, and slow down their production of Dark Troopers. The mission has a neat red haze effect over the area, giving it a grimy, dirty, outskirts of nowhere on the edge of the galaxy kind of feel. It's a welcome atmospheric effect that genuinely sets it apart from where we've been previously. Right off the jump, we can find 2 new items, the weapon Supercharge and the Fusion Cutter weapon. The Supercharge does exactly what it sounds like. It supercharges all of our weapons so they fire at quadruple speed, so we can perforate stormtroopers that much quicker. These feel like they get handed out like candy as we cruise through later levels, and they're always fucking welcome. It's like the devs intentionally decided to give players a bit of a boost and plow through waves of enemies like a goddamn Terminator. Wrong franchise, I know. We also get the Fusion Cutter weapon, which is not great. I mean, it's fine, the energy projectiles do a hefty amount of damage, but it fires so slowly, shooting one shot from each of the 4 barrels in sequence, so to me it always made my aiming feel off because I had to readjust my mental line of sight for each barrel. The alt fire shoots off all 4 barrels at once though, which is honestly pretty handy if you're in a bottleneck situation. This mission is fairly straightforward, involving racing through the complex while surrounded by and dodging pistons and machinery. Eventually we'll locate the central reactor, set the charge, and out pops our very first Dark Trooper to deal with. This Dark Trooper is just an endoskeleton, however, what they look like in the first stage of production, but they are not to be fucking trifled with. Unlike later iterations, these guys carry a short sword for melee attacks as well as a small shield for defense. The shield will simply block blaster fire, but energy attacks like the repeater or the fusion cutter will reflect off the shield and bounce back at you. Anytime these guys pop up, it is a bad time, potentially even worse than second stage Dark Troopers. This mission is a lot of fun, plenty of Stormtrooper blasting to be had, and even another weapon supercharge near the end. Although I wasn't a fan of this series of blast doors that you have to open by literally standing at the switch until they're all the way open, otherwise they'll start closing again if you leave the switch. Up till now, I've been having a really good time, literally just racing through mission after mission, wasting Imperial scum left and right, laughing hysterically with glee. But once we get to the next mission, things kind of start to take a turn. Kyle and Jan fly away from the— Holy shit! Either that is a really small planet or that reactor was fucking huge because god damn, look at how big that fucking explosion is. Anyways, Kyle and Jan zoom away from the planet and then we cut to General Mohc, who has found out our Imperial informant. Vader cautions Mohc that Katarn won't be so easy to deal with, and if Darth fucking Vader is cautioning you on someone, then that someone has got to be a pretty big deal. Of course, Mohc is a little overconfident since he's got his own rogue on the payroll, and outsteps everyone's favorite overhyped Star Wars character, Boba Fett. I'm just gonna go ahead and say it. Boba Fett is a little bitch. Well, Samuel L. Jackson killed my daddy. I'm gonna grow up to be a bounty hunter and hide in some garbage and then fall into a sarlacc pit like a little bitch, and then everyone's gonna love me for it. I hate Boba Fett simply for the fact that he is a worthless, do-nothing, dumbass piece of shit that never did anything actually cool on camera other than just look cool, and everyone seems to fucking love him for some reason because they made up badass stories about him in their minds that never actually fucking happened in canon. And yeah, he goes down like a little bitch later in this game, but we'll get there. Well, we'll get there. This mission is the hardest and most complicated mission in the game so far. We've got to sneak inside an Imperial prison, which for Kyle Katarn, sneaking equates to going in guns blazing. We've got to find the specific cell block that our informant is located on, find the specific key code for that specific cell block, pop it open, and pop our guy out of the joint. Up until this point in the game, running and gunning like a maniac has been enough to get us out of pretty much every situation. Here, we're gonna have to take a lot more caution for a couple of reasons. First off, there are a lot of Imperial soldiers in this stage. A whole fucking lot. Second, this map introduces us to the proximity mines, which are fucking disgusting. If you're not paying attention to what's on the floor, you're going to more than likely run right past one, which will beep, explode, and probably at the very least hit you with the very wide blast radius. We do get the mortar launcher in this mission as well, which can be helpful in dispatching the mines, but I would be super cautious about using explosive weapons in this mission because it is all tight corridors and little room to move around. Oh, and the walls are all coated in some kind of reflective surface which makes blaster fire bounce off the walls and all around you, so keep your aim tight while we're here. We're gonna do a lot of movement puzzling here, involving taking an elevator up and down to several different floors while trying to locate codes and keys, and here's where the game's reliance on visual cues gets a little esoteric. In one area of the prison, there's a force field preventing you from moving further into the cell block, but there's a lever you can pull to deactivate it, get by, get what you need, and then get out. But on another level of the prison, there is a similar force field with no lever anywhere in sight. Now, what you're supposed to do is watch the green light of the force field and wait for it to flicker, which tells you that you can move past it briefly. But I thought the flickering was part of the environmental set dressing, and I had no clue I was supposed to just attempt to force my way through it. I spent way too long trying to find a hidden lever that would lower this one specific force field so I could move forward, but all I really needed to do was just wait for it to flicker. I ended up turning to a walkthrough in desperation because I couldn't fucking figure out what I needed to do. Anyways, the prison level is probably the longest and most complicated level in the game. Definitely by far at this point, but once we struggle bust through, we find the informant, hop out of there, and thank God we don't have to do this again. Except we kind of do, but in a much worse scenario, but that's later. I don't really like the prison mission. Now that I know how to run it, I could see myself not minding it so much in the future, but it certainly shows off the flip side of the Lucasarts style guide, coming out of their point-and-click adventures, which sometimes operate on what fans refer to as moon logic, an example of which would be needing to figure out that using a rubber band, a piece of glue, and a magnet all in tandem are the way to retrieve some keys from a sewer grate. Dark Forces utilizes some interesting choices in which to nudge players towards a conclusion that isn't exactly obvious, and even even once solved, sometimes you'll think to yourself, how the hell was I supposed to know that? Our next mission briefing gives us some insight into General Mohc, including the little tidbit that he deeply values the art of personal combat, to the degree that he opposed the construction of the original Death Star because it put too much distance between attacker and target. Little foreshadowing there. And we also get new information that Mohc has employed a big-name gangster to smuggle supplies for the Dark Trooper project. So, we're off to Ramsey's Head to try and track down which big-name mafioso is helping out the Imperials to... It's Jabba. It's Jabba. Come on, this isn't a surprise, kids. This is a Star Wars game. We all know where this is going. Ramsey's Head is a fairly short level that's elongated by some fairly complex pathfinding. And while we're running and gunning and grinning again for the first few minutes of the run, this feeling of power fantasy is pretty quickly squashed by the introductions of the Gran and the Gamorrean guards. Gran are these three-eyed fuckers that constantly lob thermal detonators in Kyle's direction with eerie accuracy. I mean, Jesus Christ, it is a little unfair how quickly they can spot you and toss a detonator in your direction. If you thought the ogres in Quake tossed grenades a lot, then you haven't seen anything yet. The other enemy, the Gamorrean Guard, are those pig-like dudes with axes that appeared in Jabba's palace in Return of the Jedi. You see, I didn't spoil anything by saying Jabba is a gangster doing the smuggling. All you had to do was take one look at these guys and you would know. Yeah, this level just feels like the pathfinding was made intentionally obtuse in order to pad out the level because I got lost far too easily trying to get through this one. At least it's short. The next mission sees Kyle on an ice planet out to blow up yet another Dark Trooper production facility, and the sliding ice physics will either make you grit your teeth or won't be that much of a problem. Me, I've never really had an issue with ice physics in video games like some do, which is fine. Having to fight against a lack of traction in a game based on being able to rely on fast reflexes and muscle memory can genuinely suck, but I really didn't have much of an issue with that here in this mission at all. Apparently there are some ice cleats that you can find not too far away from the landing point, and the ice cleats will negate the slipperiness, but I didn't find them until I looped all the way back around at the very end of the mission. I don't really think I missed out on having them though. This mission is actually a really nice change of pace aesthetically. The white and blue of the snow and ice outside, the harsh white and lighter grays of the facility inside, the transition from the cold exterior to the machinery and the sand, or I'm not really sure what this stuff is that's pooled around everywhere, but you don't want to fall in it, that's for sure. The facility looks clean, the action is straightforward. I really enjoy this level, especially after the last two. Jan lets you know in the mission briefing that there's deadly gases around the facility and that you're going to need a gas mask at some point, and you not only very deliberately find the gas mask, but there's iconography indicating the need for the gas mask. Yeah, I don't really think I actually needed it. I was running around the pit where the supposedly dangerous gases were, and I didn't take any damage. I put the mask on anyway, which I guess was helpful. I just never actually saw or was given any indication of what it was that I was protecting myself from. I even ran through the gas mask segment again because I died and had to reload, but this time I didn't even put the mask on and nothing happened. It's really odd shit that hopefully someone can help me understand. Kyle drops 3 charges necessary for obliterating the facility, and we get our very first fight with a fully fledged Dark Trooper. These guys have jetpacks, heavy energy cannons, and rockets, and are no fucking joke. Fortunately, this first one here isn't too much trouble on his own. The fusion cutter made short work of him, but I completely forgot to swap away from the fusion cutter afterwards and ran into a couple of endo Dark Troopers, so most of my shots ended up bouncing off of their shields and hurt me instead. The repeater rifle shots reflect back at you too, Jesus fuck. Use mortars or your blaster rifle on them and keep your distance. I genuinely think the endoskeletons are worse to fight than the finished products. We escape again and Jesus Christ, that's still a big fucking explosion. Holy shit. Now we're off to Nar Shaddaa, an area that also shows up in Jedi Knight, so I immediately felt a sense of nostalgia before the map even loaded. That feeling quickly went away once I realized the whole goddamn mission is populated by Grans, Gamorreans, and our latest addition to the enemy roster, the Trandashans. Trandashans are these lizard-like guys who, just like the Grans and Gamorreans, are in Jedi Knight, and God, I really want to be playing Jedi Knight right now. I was at least familiar enough with how they were going to screw me over, and screw me over they did. Or at least they tried to. See, they're carrying our second to last weapon in the arsenal, the only other weapon you're going to want to use aside from the blaster rifle, and that is the motherfucking concussion rifle. Trandashans will drop the rifle after you dispatch them, and anytime you pick up another one off of a dead Trando, it provides 100 energy ammo to your pockets. So if you're running around maps with Trandashans, you will be flush with energy ammo, so there's really no reason to not spam the concussion rifle. Honestly, there's really no reason to not spam it in general. It fires a heavy burst of energy that causes a big shockwave, which does incredible amounts of damage. You can 1 to 2 shot almost any enemy in the game with this weapon, and it is absolutely worth it. Does have a couple of downsides though. Number 1, for some ungodly reason you can't actually see the projectile that it shoots, so gauging travel time for one of these shots over a distance can be really tricky if you're trying to take out a moving target from afar. 2, if you're not aiming precisely and you accidentally shoot your shot too close to a corner or edge of a window, the resulting up-close shockwave can cause a costly amount of damage on you. So you gotta make sure that you're not trying to get up close and personal with this bad boy. Hence why the blaster rifle basically became my secondary from here on out. Unless you're in tight corridors where splash damage is inevitable, the concussion rifle is guaranteed to kill every mother in the room, and accept no substitutes. Having to go through Nar Shaddaa with few Imperial enemies in sight really hammers home just how easy the game has been going on you this whole time. Grands and Trandashans are about as resilient as Stormtroopers, and they'll drop pretty quickly, but they can do so much more damage to you than a Stormtrooper can if you're not pulling the trigger fast enough. And Gamorreans are fucking blaster sponges. They will eat so much of your ammo before they drop. But that being said, this level, with the verticality, the back and forth running around finding keys and dodging potent attacks from the non-Imperials, adds a whole bunch of tension to the proceedings. I was into this level. I don't know, normally I might be a little pissy about a map that asks me to go back and forth, find a key, go back to a door you've passed earlier, find another key inside, go back to a door that's a lot closer to the end of the map, but the constant threat of the alien attackers had me sweaty from start to finish. So while Nar Shaddaa is long and sometimes a little frustrating, it all feels like it's in service of the player experience rather than being dickish. It's also aided by those architects that Lucasarts hired doing their job, because running around this city feels like running around an actual lived-in location, and navigating all of it feels really smooth and natural. I hope you've enjoyed that feeling though, because as soon as we find the navigational charts we came here for, we're caught up in a tractor beam and swept away into the single worst goddamn level of this entire fucking game. So in case you were still wondering which underworld big shot it was that is helping out Mohc, we're treated to a fun little cutscene where Jabba the Hutt reveals himself, gloating over Kyle's capture. What I find interesting here is that Kyle just immediately knows who Jabba is. Is Jabba the Hutt really that big a big shot that like the entire galaxy knows who this fucking slug lord godfather on a planet in the backwaters of nowhere is? Like how is this guy, who is situated on Tatooine, is just kind of known by everyone in Star Wars to the point where they all know him by his first fucking name? Anyways, so in a move that I can only describe as brain-breakingly bad, we are immediately dropped into an arena and are forced to fight a Kell Dragon with just our fists. You remember how I said that Kyle was a big beefy boy who could probably arm wrestle a Wampa? Well, here's the proof in the punch bowl that this man is absurdly strong. He's literally beating Kell Dragons to death with his hands. Kell Dragons! Their bites are melee attacks which will go right through your shields, and on medium difficulty, you could probably take 3 or 4 chomps at most before you're the meal of the day. So we have to do a tedious back and forth, circle strafing in and out of melee range, punching this giant fucking lizard to death, and I'm just like, okay, sure, fine. I understand dropping us into a situation with limited resources and forcing us to work our way around getting our gear back, but like, fists only against a fucking Kell Dragon? Oh, and here's another one, but by this point we've taken out a grand bodyguard and stolen a couple of thermal detonators, so we can at least whittle this thing down a touch before being forced into fisting again. Find the blue key to get out of the Kell Dragon arena, take out some Gamorrean guards with fucking proximity mines. And for the next few minutes, the corridors are a panicked rush of running past and around Gamorreans and Grands, rushing in for a single punch at a time, ducking in and out of doors, scrambling for explosive weapons that are super unreliable. Meanwhile, there are other proximity mines scattered all around the map, meaning if you're not paying attention during this initial rush, you're gonna get caught up in the blast radius of either a prox mine placed by someone else, by yourself, or from a thermal detonator. This opening is by far the single most stressful experience in the entire game, and even once you get your gear back, it does not get much better. With the concussion rifle in hand, it's definitely a little easier to take out prox mines on the floor, but they are everywhere here, so you need to be very, very aware of your surroundings. The number of times in this single mission that I stepped through a doorway just to hear the beep of a proximity mine as it activated, out of sight, just around the corner, was fucking aggravating. Look at this! Look at this! 2 fucking landmines right here as soon as the door opens. 2! The explosive damage alone from those 2 is enough to kill you if you are not paying attention. That is mean, That is rude, and I demand an apology from the developers. We've already discussed how Gran and Trandoshans, with their uncanny accuracy with detonators and concussion rifles, can undo a solid run within seconds. So now imagine an entire level filled to the brim with Gran, Trandoshans, Gamorreans, and proximity mines laid out in the most dickish placement ever. You'll find yourself constantly taking hits from splash damage of every single variety that this game can possibly dish out, while you're checking corners, sweating, and praying that you can pull the trigger before anyone else can. Oh, and here's another couple Kell Dragons that you have to take out. At least I had a full arsenal by this point, but just the sight of another one of these goddamn things was enough to send me into full PTSD. Jabba's ship is just God, it is mean. I know that there are some who lean into the whole badass concept of taking out a Kell Dragon with just your fists, but sweet Dippin' Dots. Seeing someone else do it and doing it yourself are two entirely different fucking concepts. By the time this mission was up, I had thoroughly had enough of dealing with non-Imperial enemies. It's really interesting to note here the enemy imbalance in this game where you're dealing with alien enemies versus human enemies. The Imperials are all basically the same. They fire blasters at you, they aren't very resilient at all, and they have some droids to help them out here and there. But for the most part, they all do fairly minimal damage and can be taken out fairly quickly. They're only really problematic when you're facing them in groups that all bear down on you at the same time. The alien enemies, however, all pack a deadly punch, can mostly be taken out at the same pace as the Imperials, and when you find yourself surrounded by groups of them, you will find yourself in a bad way far, far too quickly. I kind of wish that there had been tougher Imperial enemies and less deadly alien enemies to create more of a hierarchy in the game, kind of like how other FPS titles create more fodder enemies to distract you from the tougher, heavier enemy types that will fuck you way too fast if you ignore them. You need to swat the flies so they don't cloud your vision, but you also got to make sure you take out that big ass hornet or you're in for a bad time. Dark Forces doesn't really have this kind of hierarchy. Sure, we do have to face the Dark Troopers here and there, and they constitute the heavy Imperial baddies we have to face. But as far as general enemy types, the alien goons are the ones that hit the hardest. Much, much harder than the Imperials. But the problem with this is that when we're facing against Imperials, there's generally no goons. And when we're facing off against goons, there's generally no Imperials. This lack of mixing and balancing creates the stunning, thrilling missions where we're just fucking chewing through stormtroopers and officers and droids like we're the Star Wars version of the Doom guy. But facing down solely alien enemies and how hard they hit, all of that bravado suddenly turns to panic and anxious corner checking, deflating the power fantasy with a single pendulum swing. And I guess that's fine if that's the intent, but it really does make the different maps feel really imbalanced on a difficulty scale depending on which faction of foes you're primarily facing down. Once we found Jan and we've hopped back into the Moldy Crow, our next mission is to infiltrate the Imperial city on Coruscant to find a deciphering code so we can figure out the navigation charts we've stolen, track down General Mohc's ship, the Arkhammer, and really put the hurt to the Dark Trooper program. This map is great. I had a few pathfinding issues early on that had my head twisted around, but otherwise we're up against what is thus far the largest number of Imperial troopers in any mission. Just fucking waves of them. Multiple Dark Trooper encounters. It's great. This is the mission where we get our final weapon, the Assault Cannon, which is employed by the final form of the Dark Trooper. Primary fire is a devastating energy blast, and secondary fire is a goddamn rocket launcher, both of which are used by the Dark Troopers against us. I used it a little bit here against the Dark Troopers, but I mostly held off on using this weapon until the final mission. Despite all the running and gunning, however, there is a fiendishly clever door puzzle right before our objective we have to solve, which confused the hell out of me at first, but once I understood what was being asked of me, it felt like the sky had opened up above me and God's light shone through. So you have to open a series of doors in concentric circles leading to a central computer core that provides access to the decoder we need to utilize so that we can read these star charts. But the way that the door switches work is that each one controls 3 separate doors that all line up in the 3 concentric circles. Depending on how you activate the switch, it'll open up the door in the first ring, the second, or the third. You have to figure out the correct order to open and close the doors in each ring to allow you to enter into the center, which involves running back and forth, opening, closing, and reopening doors to maze yourself around the difficult path to victory. I'm definitely explaining this all wrong and in the least detailed way possible, but this puzzle, on paper, ought to be difficult and frustrating. And while it can try your patience at first, I thought it was an extraordinary brain teaser that, once I understood what I needed to do, was a brilliant exercise in classic Lucasarts puzzle work. Of course, escaping is not going to be all that easy, as Jan tries to warn us that something bad is going down topside, but she's cut off before we can hear what it is. When we get to the pickup site, though, we find motherfucking Boba Fett, baby. And he goes down like a little bitch. Seriously, like 6 or 7 rounds from the concussion rifle and he's done for. Here, you can just watch the unedited fight. Why the fuck do you kids like this guy again? Anyways, Jan bumps into the wall on her way to pick us up, and we're back in the air and we're on our way to the next mission, the fueling station. This is a pretty fun mission, again, facing off against mostly Imperial forces, but we've got some alien goons mixed in as well. It's a really rare and welcome treat to see a Gran and a Stormtrooper on screen at the same time, weighing who to shoot at first, striking that good balance that I was lamenting the lack of just a mission or two ago. I did get a little bit lost in this one because, in true LucasArts fashion, you're supposed to pay attention to the switch you flip to access a separate section of the fueling station. You're supposed to activate this panel, which will then show a docking platform move from this position to this position. Now, I wasn't paying attention at first, and I didn't see the change in the display, so when it looked like nothing had changed, I went back, activated the panel again, which changed the docking ramp back to the original position, and I couldn't make my way to the ship I needed to stow away on. It took a lot of backtracking and a bit of a walkthrough to figure out exactly what I had done wrong, which is a bit annoying because the literal layout of this map is that the docking ramp is on the opposite side of the panel you need to activate. So it's a bit of a trek back and forth. Still, that fuck up lies directly on me for not paying attention. Once you have everything in place, you just have to fight your way on board the Imperial ship, get into a hiding spot, and hold on while we load up the next mission, which is... Alright nerds, get ready for it. We're hopping on board the Executor, Darth Vader's Super Star Destroyer. This mission is just a fucking blast. From start to finish, we're back to basics, running and gunning through hordes of stormtroopers with the ultimate goal of reaching the cargo transport vessel meant to deliver goods to General Mohc's ship, the Arc Hammer. There's minimal pathfinding, few environmental puzzles, classic Star Wars tunes in MIDI form blasting in your ears. It's just all killer, no filler, and it is up there with the opening missions as some of the most thrilling and fun design in the whole of the game. Once we've boarded the cargo vessel, we're on to the final mission of the game, the Arc Hammer. Jan gives us a final reminder about the two different versions of the Dark Troopers, basically tells us to cross our fingers, and we're diving into what is quite possibly the largest and longest mission in the game. Legions of Imperial soldiers, prototype Dark Troopers, final stage Dark Troopers, platform puzzles, switch puzzles, conveyor belts. LucasArts threw the whole kitchen jizz band into this mission and then some. This is a jizz band, by the way, so swallow those dirty thoughts before you come inside the comment section. Oh, and make sure you wash your hands before you touch your keyboards. Kids these days, I swear. The final mission is all about setting explosive charges just like we did in the previous Dark Trooper production facilities, meaning we can probably expect another massive explosion at the end of the level. The Arc Hammer maintains the same forward momentum gained from the Executor level. Lots of blaster fire, combat situations, more classic Star Wars tunes to keep the adrenaline pumping. This is as close to being able to step into the experience of the original Star Wars films and go through them in first person. Like, I've played plenty of Star Wars games. 9 times out of 10, they're all aiming to replicate the Star Wars experience, which then in turn feels like you're playing a game about Star Wars rather than experiencing Star Wars, if you follow me. But here, assaulting the Arc Hammer from the inside out, coupled with the Executor mission, and hell, pretty much most of this game, this right here is the genuine article. Sound effects, musics, visuals, aesthetics, atmosphere. Dark Forces is one of the few times in my gaming life where I felt like I was inside of a Star Wars adventure rather than just being presented with something that simply resembled Star Wars. And this is absolutely fucking fantastic. The final gauntlet is riveting stuff. Multiple Dark Troopers in a row in a giant bay that culminates in a one-on-one battle against General Mohc himself in modified Dark Trooper armor. This is what we have been building up to this entire game. A final showdown against the primary antagonist, mano a mano, gun versus gun, an epic reckoning with he goes down like a little bitch. Not as much of a bitch as Boba Fett, but still like a little bitch. And that's it. That's the mission. We get evac'd on a shuttle and... Oh, wait, just gotta kill this one officer first.
Stop where you are.
And then, just as the charges go off, Kyle Katarn zooms away from the Arc Hammer, which explodes into a fiery mess as Darth Vader watches on.
This is an unfortunate setback. The Force is strong with Katarn.
Oh, you have no idea, Sonny Jim. Mon Mothma presents Kyle with a Medal of Honor in the final cutscene. We see him fly away in the Moldy Crow and off into hyperspace, presumably to his next adventure, and the credits roll. And I gotta say, hot damn kids, this was an absolute fucking ride. Dark Forces is a game that pulls no punches and swings for the fences constantly. This is certainly not LucasArts' first Star Wars game, nor was it even their first Star Wars action title, but it was a stretch of their creative muscles, and at times it shows. Jabba's ship is probably the most glaring example of it, with exhausting enemy types, aggressive proximity mine placement, all of which serving to highlight the glaring difficulty imbalance when facing off against Imperial soldiers versus alien bounty hunters and goons. The prison level also serves to show how LucasArts LucasArts was, while drawing inspiration from Wolfenstein and Doom, still a game company in the mindset of adventure narratives with sometimes obtuse puzzles to solve. Dark Forces is a game that has not only aged surprisingly well, but has done so with love and support from the community. The Force Engine source port has been in development for some time, and made headlines across gaming sites recently upon its debut. That's how it came to my attention just as I was about to dive into this game using DOSBox. And you know what? I'm really glad I didn't have to. The support for widescreen, full mouse look, higher resolution graphics, all of this serves to highlight just how gorgeous and easy to play Dark Forces is, and is a big win for PC game preservation. Going over my footage, listening to the sound effects, the music, watching the visuals, and noting the sense of speed, it's very clear that Darren Stinnett, Justin Chin, and the rest of the crew who worked on this had a deep passion for Star Wars. You might think that's pretty obvious, but not every Star Wars game I've played has felt like it was made by people who are passionate for Star Wars. Look, we've got to be honest with ourselves here. Star Wars isn't just the rebellious series of films inspired by sci-fi pulp of the 1930s anymore. Star Wars is a franchise, a multimedia empire with games, books, films, TV shows, toys, and merchandise of all shapes and sizes. It's a little too easy to dream up something to slap the Star Wars logo onto and market to a generation of children who don't even know what a jizz band is. When George Lucas made Star Wars in 1977, nobody believed in his movie. His friends, peers, even sometimes the actors in his own film couldn't wrap their heads around what he was trying to do. He was constantly fighting budget concerns, struggling to create new technology to film special effects no one had ever seen before, script rewrites, you name it. If it could go wrong, it went wrong. Lucas was so stressed out that on July 17th, 1976, in the middle of filming, he left the set with chest pain so bad that he thought he was having a heart attack. Turns out, it was hypertension and exhaustion. George Lucas fought every single day to have his vision realized, and he fought so hard that he stressed himself into the hospital. What I'm trying to say is this. Once upon a time, Star Wars was the rebellion. Now it's the Empire. Star Wars is everywhere. It's in every store, every website, every social media. Star Wars is ubiquitous, not binding like the Force, but contentious like Imperial forces descending upon Ferrix, no longer visitors, but invaders. And maybe that is a statement that won't sit well with many Star Wars fans, but it's hard not to feel that way, especially when it was the fans who carried Star Wars with the expanded universe for literally decades, only for Disney to purchase the franchise and then declare all works in the expanded universe to be non-canon. Maybe Disney is the Empire. Who knows? We're at least starting to see passionate creators return to making Star Wars content with such shows as The Mandalorian and Andor, and yes, I will defend The Last Jedi and Solo as two films made by people who are passionate about Star Wars. And before anyone floods the comments about the animated shows, no, I am not a fan of animated shows just kind of in general, so I have not watched those and I am not commenting on their quality. Listen, even if the story is flawed and doesn't quite hit the notes that the fans want, there's a huge difference between a Star Wars made by someone who grew up loving and being enveloped by the stories that came out of the films, and a Star Wars made by someone who was hired to do so. You can tell a Star Wars game made out of a passionate drive to make something set within the universe of the films and tell a new story, and a game made out of a corporate responsibility to have a specific tie-in. Across all eras of Star Wars, those two types of games exist. Dark Forces, from opening crawl to closing credits, feels like a game born of passion. It feels like Star Wars, and not like a Star Wars product. On top of that, mechanically, it's a damn fine first-person shooter. I was sweating and cackling and swearing and generally running amok like a bat out of hell through 75% of this game. Even when the game missteps, it somehow maintains a sense of janky, just barely held together rust bucket glory that the Millennium Falcon had in Empire Strikes Back. Yes, this thing is kind of breaking down in places, but if you just hold it together long enough, it'll get you out of the asteroid belt and back into hyperspace. Maybe Dark Forces isn't perfect, but it's got its heart in the right place. And damn it, if that doesn't carry a lot of weight as far as Star Wars goes, I'm gonna give this game an 8 out of 10. Alright kids, if you've made it this far into the video, that means that you haven't been completely bounced out by my blasphemous views on the War of the Stars, for which I thank you. There's been a lot of new subscribers and viewers lately, and I'm humbled and grateful for all of you being here. If you want to support the channel further, I have a link to my Patreon in the description. And for just $1 a month, you can help me make videos and also get early access to every video I put out. I also have a Discord where I hang out and share memes and shitpost and do group-wide deathmatch events once a month. Next time on the History of FPS, we're gonna take a descent into a complicated series of mining misadventures, and for the first time ever in PC gaming, look at a fully 3D environment and game space. Until then, kids, stay hydrated, sit up straight, and may the Force be with you. I'll see you next time.